Should Florida State join the SEC or Big Ten if they have the option?
You are Locked On Seminoles, your daily podcast on the Florida State Seminoles. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome back into another podcast here at Locked On Seminoles. I'm your host, Brian Smith. Today's show is going to feature the opportunity to go to the ACC or the Big Ten. I'm going to bring in one of my favorite people to talk football with, and it's probably not somebody that you like because he's a Florida guy, but he does know football pretty well. That's Brandon Olson from Locked On Gators. This impacts you, not just because Florida State are rivals, but the SEC is quite honestly in a really unique spot. They're the one league that really doesn't have to expand outside the normal footprint all that much, although Missouri, you can kind of argue. That's about it. Do you think they should? Is something we'll get to. Why do you think Florida State should or shouldn't? I mean, the whole grant of right thing we can get into if you want. I'm not. Look, I hate talking about it. I've said it on this show. I know you're not a big fan of it either. It's just super lawyer talk, and I'm not going to fool people into thinking I'm a lawyer. I'd make a fool of myself. I don't care about that stuff. But I want to get down to which side you're on because I'm legitimately split because you got to look at revenue, proximity. This is technically a situation where they're student athletes. Going to play games at Oregon is not all that beneficial for student athletes. Going to games at Maryland, then turning around 2 weeks later, you're going back up to the north, you're going to Penn State. The Big Ten has pitfalls, SCs in Los Angeles. But the SEC, if they join, I mean, you would still play Florida. It'd be a league game. You'd have more opportunities outside the league because you'd gain another league game with a rival. But it's a harder league. It's, in my opinion, harder to get to the playoff. So there's a million different things. So to begin, Brandon, I'm just going to allow you to kind of open up on this. And before we get started, we're going to talk recruiting here in a minute. And LinkedIn is the recruiting sponsor across this. I'm going to bring up this is the one area I'm very strong on, why I think recruiting would be influenced in one conference more than the other. But what are your thoughts overall on Florida State?
I think if you're Florida State, you should want to go to the SEC. I mean, that travel schedule that you mentioned of having to go to Oregon and having to travel all throughout the United States with the Big Ten is really the big 50 states at this time. It makes no sense to me, but just region based, you don't want to have to do that much travel. That's NFL travel there.
It really is.
It's that kind of schedule. And it makes sense to do it, early in the season when we saw Ohio State and Oregon face off. And that makes sense where it's just a marquee matchup early in the season, fun game. But you don't want to have to do that year in, year out in the middle of the season at random times. You could be traveling to Oregon for a game, have to come back to Tallahassee, and then have to go up to Ohio State, up to Penn State in just back-to-back weeks. And that's just a lot of travel to have to deal with. At least the SEC has expanded a little bit regionally, but even then it's marginal. Like you mentioned, it's Missouri. It's Oklahoma, Texas, go a little bit further west, but to go to the Pacific Northwest is just not a situation you want to be in. And of course, SEC's the premier conference. Even if it's overblown with how dominant the SEC is, it's still thought of as the premier conference in college football.
Yeah, I think the travel is unfair. There's a couple of points on that in extension. You and I have talked about on this show and on your show, one of the problems college has now is NIL in the portal. Coaches don't like it. You can argue whether they should or not. That's not the point. They don't like it because it's a lot of extra work on their plate. It screws up their family lives, etc. Because of that, if it's even a pay cut, a lot of them will go to take a back office job or a lower level job at the NFL level because they want continuity with where they are day to day so they can see friends and family. Simple as that. If you go and start playing schedules that, like, again, Oregon to Maryland is not very friendly for a schedule. It's not. How much do you think, and this isn't just Florida State, but any team they would take from the South, whether it was North Carolina State, Clemson, Miami, whatever, how many of those coaching staffs would lose guys, albeit quietly, because they'll be like, look, coach, my wife's going to divorce me if I do this. And there would be conversations like that. Stuff happens. I've had those conversations with coaches. They hate the recruiting part, and it's not as much as it used to be on the road, but there's still a lot of it. If you add that back in and they constantly are just everywhere but home, especially those with small children, that could cause a lot of problems. So that's a hurt. And then the other part of it is you're talking about the financial stream that you're pulling away. Can you imagine what the cost would be? And they're already in the red. I'm not trying to pick on them, but basketball and football make your money. There are only a few schools that have any sport, men or women, that make money other than basketball and football. Like Tennessee basketball used to be, I would assume, South Carolina basketball now, women's, Connecticut, Nebraska baseball at one point, LSU baseball. There's a few. But still, overall, you're still struggling to pay for the Title IX sports. All the women's sports and most of the guys, that they just don't make money. Now you got to travel further with all them. They'd have to come up with ways to play fewer games in the conference and do things because you just can't have that many. It's a nightmare. So I don't see how the Big Ten is an easy thing to discuss. Like the paperwork for the proposal for the Big Ten would be like this. The SEC would be like this. I'm not saying it's the automatic better one. It's just more complicated. And I was just thinking about, like, if you wanted, somebody's probably written this article. Florida State joins the Big Ten. Here's what the mileage would be if they had this schedule, how many miles they would fly per team. It would be insane. So you got the academics, you got the finance, you got the coaches not liking it. There are a lot of negatives on that. Next up, give me your pitch for why it would be better for Florida State to join the Southeastern Conference. Like it's a no-doubter. Can you make a no-doubter pick? To me, I think, like, culturally, it's obviously the better pick. But there are some things with the Big Ten, too, I like. So I'll let you go first.
I think for Florida State, the biggest pitch to go to the SEC would be the recruiting aspect. And I think that's a big part of it for you. But I feel like that's a big – because right now, when you consider talking about the big three recruiting, and it's Florida State, Miami, one of the biggest selling points that Florida has is, hey, like, you want to come play in the SEC? The ACC champions just didn't even make the college football playoff. That's how disrespected the ACC is. So you get to the SEC. That's never going to be a conversation with the SEC. It's always going to be, hey, you want to come here? Go ahead. But then you want to play in the SEC? You want to play the top talent? Go ahead and do that and come do it in the SEC. So for Florida State, I think the biggest selling point for why you should go to the SEC is simply that. Now, I don't know if they'd ever really get into the SEC because, there's people have to vote and make some decisions, and things can be lobbied in certain ways, we'll say. But
we'll get into that in a minute. You're 100% correct.
Oh yeah.
We'll get into that in a second. It's a very awkward conversation. Politicians involved, etc. It is extremely awkward, but we'll get there.
Yeah, everybody would have that conversation. That's going to be a big selling point. But I think the biggest reasoning would be go there for recruiting purposes. You get there, you tie it up with Florida. Florida State's already won battles against the Gators with recruiting, and they've done that. They've done their part. Having that Florida State, Miami, whoever it is, if you can join the SEC, you now are on that same level. And obviously, even if you're finding more success than Florida in recruiting or on the field, now you get to say you're doing it in the SEC, and you take away what's one of Florida's biggest pitches in the big three schools.
Yeah, that's a big one. Here's something I ran into last year by accident. I was at IMG for their preseason camp, and they set it up upstairs for us right above the practice field. They had a room. They brought all the players in. One by one, we interviewed them. TJ Lindsey was a kid recruited by a ton of schools, ended up signing with Auburn. And I didn't even ask him this because I'd never thought about it that much because he had offers from all over the place. And he said, I picked Auburn, but if everything had been equal and they'd both been in the same league, I'd have picked Miami, but Miami's not in the SEC. And I went, whoa. Nobody even asked him. He just literally spit that out. He liked Miami better overall, but he wanted to play in the SEC. And that was it. That's rough. Like, as a staff, that's got to stick in your craw a little bit. Like, so we won, but we don't get the player. I don't think I would have liked that very much if I'd have been anybody. I don't care which, that was Miami in that case. But I remember just like my buddy was covering Auburn at the time, and I just sent him the interview. And I called some other people, and I'm like, did you hear why you got this? You know what I mean? And it was just hilarious. So that really brought it to my attention. So we might as well get to this point now. And for those, again, LinkedIn is today's sponsor for all the recruiting stuff. And we're going to go right into this now. They do a great job. If you have any hiring needs, especially for a small business, LinkedIn is the great place to go. Florida State, before your time, was without a doubt the most dominant recruiting machine that I'd ever seen. They had, I believe it was 14 straight years they finished in the top 4 in the AP poll, which is insane. But the reason they did, they also, in that same stretch, I don't think they had a class that wasn't top 3 in recruiting. Like, it was a machine. My buddy made a comment once, somewhat hyperbole. He goes, Brian, Bowden is to the point that he could open the door at Florida State on signing day with no commitments and sign a top 10 class. And I'm like, okay, that might be a little much. But like the location, it's just happy medium to everything. You're 5 hours pretty much to everything outside of Miami. And they just get a couple of Miami kids, but they got like Marvin Jones, different guys like that. They get a couple of elite kids, ton of South Georgia kids, get an Alabama kid, get a kid from Memphis, one kid from DC. They just plucked a few players all over, kind of like Billy does at UF. And they did it without the SEC moniker. And SEC was still important then, but not as much now. Could you imagine what Bowden would have done with the SEC moniker the way it is now? They'd have the number 1 class every single year. So I know that some people that are listening to this podcast are going to say, hey, I want to be in the SEC because of recruiting. I already know what you're going to say to this. But the comment that you made a minute ago, I'll let you go into it and I'll add on. Why do you think some people, whether it's Florida or whatever, would not want Florida State in the SEC? And I'm talking about coaches in the Southeastern Conference that are currently in the league. Give me your pitch for why they would not want the Noles in the SEC.
I mean, my biggest pitch would obviously be from Florida. Billy Napier, when he got hired, I remember it was like a second or third press conference, and he was just like, college football nowadays is a talent acquisition business.
He's 100% right.
Yeah, he's 100% right. And I don't know about you, but any business I've ever seen doesn't want to let one of their biggest direct competitors level the playing field a little bit with them. So if you're Florida, and I understand I'm the kind of person where I'm like, hey, let them in. Like I want it to be a league matchup. I want it to be league play, add fuel to the rivalry. But if you're I'm not coaching for my job. I'm not doing that.
That's
for my
the
job.
other part of that. You have nothing at stake.
Right. Yeah, it's like I could say things like that, but if you're actually coaching Florida and that's your big pitch against Florida State and Miami, just go, hey, like, why would we let them in the SEC? Like, why would we let our competitor, again, just get a step up when we have that? Why would we give up the advantage? Because I mean, the entire world it's greedy. It's about having more power, more money, whatever it is. Why are you going to let a direct competitor do that? So that's the easiest reason for why Florida wouldn't let Florida State in there, for why a school like even Georgia would just say, hey, like we can still talk about Florida State and say, we're the SEC. They're regionally going to be competing for similar players. They compete for similar recruits just based on proximity. Why would you give them any breathing room here when it's getting harder in the SEC? Because now you can't even say that about Texas and Oklahoma. Texas and Oklahoma used to be able to talk about the Big 12, and now they're in the SEC. So for Florida, who brought in DJ Lagway from the state of Texas, who's brought in a lot of players from Texas in recent years, probably 3 per year on average lately. You don't have that. Okay, well, if you want to come play in the SEC, you can either go to Texas A&M, which is a joke, or you can come to Florida, which might be considered one also. But your selling point here is that it's you don't want to let anybody get into this structure when it's already getting increasingly more difficult to win these battles with just the SEC name.
I agree. And here's the other part. Remember when Texas was first announced that bombshell with them in Oklahoma? There was a certain guy who has since been fired in College Station that immediately said, well, we don't want him. Everybody knew what he was saying. We don't want to recruit against the Texas name with the SEC logo. And I bet you a lot of A&M fans were mad at him for saying it the way he did because he looked like a scared little girl. He did. It was pathetic. I'm not saying Florida's like that because they wouldn't be, but it just, from a business perspective, it does not behoove you to allow somebody similar cachet. Let's just put it that way. So here's the problem. Coaches don't vote on it. Jimbo didn't get a vote. The people that vote are the league commissioners, et cetera, like ESPN and all that. But here is the caveat, and it's the gray area. It's an election year anyway. But there are people in Florida that also, guess what? They vote just for, congressman. The person that doesn't lobby for Florida State to get in, there's some people that won't vote for him, and vice versa. The Florida fan, if somebody does lobby for him, they won't vote. Politicians will be dragged into this, whether they want to be or not. It would get to that point. If the grant of rights happens, which eventually they're going to come to some settlement, this is going to happen. There will be politicians that are trying to drag, and they're going to try to get out of it and not say anything because they want no part of it. Because they can't win because there's so many FSU fans and so many Florida fans just alone. That is a nasty scenario, and it changes money, changes who has power and all kinds of things. So they're both state institutions. All those meetings and stuff, people can look up notes and all that. That is a lot of complexity. Next, the thing that I really am curious about with you, do you think Florida State, I don't know how big there's been rumors about the SEC adding on multiple teams. I assume they'd try to take Clemson too. Clemson, from a social fit and all that, SEC all day. It's 15 minutes from the Georgia border, and it's due east of the University of Georgia. It's about an hour from UGA. Like, the two schools are super close. They're closer than Auburn and Alabama are. They're closer than UF and Florida State, et cetera. Which school do you think would have the easier transformation into the league? Clemson or Florida State?
I'd say Florida State. I think Clemson, especially if Dabo is the head coach, because if we're talking about just acclimating to the league, recruiting, all that, I don't think Clemson has the cool factor. If that makes sense, I think having Dabo is, people don't care that much about Dabo, how they don't want to play in the transfer portal era. They're the only Power 4 program that hasn't taken in a transfer so far. That their NIL comment that he made about what name, image, and likeness they deal in, that's fine. That's cool. That's not going to get you anything in the SEC. So I think the Florida State just being more willing to kind of make adjustments and again, have that little cool factor that Clemson really severely lacks right now. I think it'd make it a lot easier for them to get in. And then, of course, you have we can tell in-state kids in Florida, hey, now we're in the SEC too. So it's not just like, oh, you want to play in the SEC, you got to go to Gainesville.
That is the one thing that has always helped them, even back to the Spurrier days. SEC's been the better league. But now, ACC used to be bad. It was really bad. Now it's a lot more competitive. Clemson's come on. Miami's in the league, so at least they're sometimes competitive. NC State's a pain. Louisville's been pretty good, et cetera. But it's still not the gamut like the SEC West was. That was ridiculous. So, like, Arkansas was a solid team and would be at the bottom of the league. So, anyway, I think that you're right. Here's the thing that I find very interesting. If you're a Florida State fan, there are a lot of things socially. The SEC, it's obvious. Proximity and culture, it's not a negotiation. But if you knew, guaranteed, okay, Florida State's going to the Big Ten, pick the year, 28, 26, whatever. Year 2, you're getting a national title by going to the Big Ten. I know this is a hypothetical. Would you take that, then not knowing anything afterwards, and you're still dealing with the travel, the expense, all the other things, harder on the student athletes, harder to get coaches, all that? Would you take that? Or would you just roll the dice and still rather be in the SEC? Winning a title, no matter what league you're in, is hard. So what do you say to that?
I think you take it. I think you take any national title you can get. It's so damn tough to get it. And also, I think it's important that, eventually we're probably going to see the death of the NCAA, where it's really the SEC and Big Ten kind of set up the NFL style, and how the NFL started with, there was the NFL and there was the AFL, and now there's the NFC and the AFC, and we're seeing it even with the merger. Yeah, you're just probably going to see basically that in the SEC and Big Ten, of just these two super leagues going at it and kind of trying to connect and have, we just each have 24 teams in our conferences, and we're just going to go to battle, and then the playoff would be the playoff with 8 teams from each side or whoever they're going to set it up. I don't know. This hair doesn't scream smart, right? But so I think you break it up however that may be. They're eventually going to do battle. But to answer your question, if you can win a national championship, you take it 10 times out of 10.
I think some people, I mean, living down here, it's an experience. Southern people don't change much. They like what they do, and they kind of stick with it. I think a lot of people, plus they have pride in their institution, would still take the SEC route because I think they could immediately acclimate. It's not easy, but I still think some would. Whether or not that's the better decision, I don't know. The cultural part, I think, is just a big part of why most people that I have personally spoken with, hey, I'd rather be in the SEC. We're in Florida. Logistically, socially, logically, it makes more sense. The financial part, there's different things. The Big Ten could make it more lucrative. They might make them a special deal. They might give them some of the money they lose in the grant. All that stuff, I have no idea. And anybody is welcome to comment on YouTube. Please like and subscribe while I'm thinking of it. But it is such a conundrum to figure out, well, would the SEC or ACC offer more money? Is there any special deal? Would other league members get mad? Like, there's the number of questions is literally limitless. So while they're battling all of these ridiculous things in the courts, and I hate that lawsuit because they're trying to drag it out and talk about the ACC as long as they can, because they know once Florida State or Clemson wins or gets out, then everybody's going to bolt. So I think the ACC is just in a holding pattern. That's my opinion. My last question here, and I'll get you out of here on this. With Florida State, they're obviously a really good program right now. Do you think it would immediately elevate them in terms of just like stature, TV revenue, and everything else? Like, would you think everything they did with sponsors would be easier with the SEC, or am I overrating the value of the Southeastern logo in what it is? Because, I mean, Florida State's still a big brand, don't get me wrong. But we're talking about a league and not a team. Is it exponential or is it just a bump? I mean, ACC is certainly not the SEC. So there's a bump. But how much are we talking?
I think it's a pretty big bump. There's a reason that when conference realignment pops off, it's often about the SEC. With Texas and Oklahoma, that was probably conference realignment popping off bigger than we've seen it in terms of media. I know every other Locked On show that talked about it blew up, and Locked On SEC was just having record numbers. He was putting Barry Bonds numbers up when Texas and Oklahoma came in.
True.
It's that bigger brand that just, again, no matter how much people overblow it or talk too much about the SEC power, where basketball, they kind of folded this year. Football, they were losing to every other conference. It's still national recognition wise bigger than the Big Ten, bigger than everything else. Whether or not quality is there or not, as far as national recognition goes, it's still bigger than everyone else. Because also people think Big Ten, and you think Iowa's in there, Nebraska's in there. You're like, okay, they're going to ground and pound it, and it's not going to be super fun, but they're going to do their style. But you think of the SEC, and I think that you think of higher quality, whether or not they're actually performing that way.
There's some truth in that. There have been some years the SEC wasn't as good as its reputation, but the top end with Georgia and Alabama or LSU, one of those three was always a top 3 team, and that gives them more cachet. They're usually really exciting. Having some of the quarterbacks like at LSU and Alabama and stuff here lately, now even Georgia's got a guy that's a Heisman guy. When you could put the trench guys with them, it's pretty hard to beat from a selling product if you're ABC, CBS, whatever. So I get that. Brandon, we're going to talk more about this sometime in the next few weeks. I have a feeling. I'm hoping, praying that there's some kind of lean one way or the other, that we used to have some kind of fortitude. Okay, we know this court case is going to come to a head about this time, because right now I have no idea. That's why I haven't talked about it on my show that much. It's just a lot of conjecture in both sides trying to get it thrown out, talking about the grant of rights. But eventually, the only thing that matters, they can try all they want. Eventually, Florida State's going to be in the Big Ten or the SEC. Prove me wrong. If anybody wants to comment on that on the YouTube page, I'd love to argue with you, because I don't think there's much chance that they're not. But anyway, this has been Locked On Seminoles. Thank you very much. Everybody come back and see us again very soon.